right, the dreaded FOIL problem. What makes this more difficult than the distributive property problem we looked at previously is that I'm now multiplying two terms from this left binomial by two terms from the right binomial. Note that each one of these binomials, it's a binomial because there's that separation of terms. Each one has that minus sign separating the two things. 8 minus root 10 is not the same thing as 8 root 10. This would be multiplying this as a binomial, two completely separate terms. So it's just like when we used to multiply things like x plus 2 times x plus 3. We need to take more into account. So the acronym to help us with that process is called FOIL. And this is where I recommend adding in some color, possibly drawing in some boxes, filling out some boxes. Whatever you want to do to organize your work is certainly okay with me. I organize it by actually writing it out. F-O-I-L. FOIL. Should be familiar from that polynomials unit. F stands for first. We're talking about the first term in each binomial. In this case, it's an 8 and a 3. O stands for outside. We're talking about the two terms furthest away from one another. So we have the 8 and the negative root 10. I'm going to bring the sign down with. I stands for outside. Let's try that again. I stands for inside, the two terms that are the closest to one another. In this case, that is a negative root 10 and a 3. And L stands for last, which is a negative root 10 times another negative root 10. So despite the fact that there's a lot going on here, this is going to be one of our nicer FOIL problems. A lot of good is going to come out of this problem here. So if we take a look at some of the things I forgot to do, like write the word last. All right. If we take a look at some of the multiplication that's about to happen here, 8 times 3, looking at our first again, 8 times 3 is just the whole number 24. No big deal there. And then our outside and inside terms, the work is going to be very similar. Note that in the outside term I have an 8, which is a whole number, it's not a square root. So 8 times root 10 is just 8 root 10. We do want to be careful with signs here because that 8 is positive and that root 10 is negative. A positive times a negative is negative. Same thing with our inside terms, just a different number. I'm multiplying that negative root 10 by 3. Negative times a positive is negative. We don't multiply like the 3 by the 10, for example, because that 3 is a whole number. It stays outside. So right away we notice there are going to be some like terms to take care of. We will deal with that after we play with this last term a bit. The last one is interesting. If we use the power rule here, note that we're multiplying that 10 under the radical by another 10 under the radical. 10 times 10 is 100. Once again, we want to be careful with signs. A negative times a negative would make that positive. We're not quite done with that yet because the square root of 100 is a nice whole number. If you don't remember your perfect squares, again, we've got that cheat sheet that lists them all for you. The square root of 100 is 10. So what happens in this problem that makes it fairly nice is we have two sets of like terms. 24 and 10, those are just nice whole numbers. So we can add those together. 24 plus 10 is 34. Again, that's coming from the 24 and the 10. And then we can also add the like terms that have a square root of 10. So negative 8 and a negative 3, like two coefficients there. Negative 8 minus 3 is negative 11. Pardon me, not root 3. Negative 11, root 10s. Those were like radicals, so we can put those ones together. If you're getting lost on the like radicals, you can think about this as if it were a negative 8x and a negative 3x. We would combine those by saying, oh, negative 8, take away 3 more, that's a negative 11x. Just now, instead of x, my variable is a root 10. It's a defined value instead of a variable, which is nice. So this is our first FOIL problem. Didn't turn out too crazy. We did have some like terms. Things simplified quite nicely. Before moving on to the next foil video, which is going to be a bit more intense, double check that you understand all of the numbers here, where things come from. If you don't, please raise a hand, stop it here. I want to make sure that you are comfortable with this one before we take a look at the slightly spicier version.